Welcome to Economic Development Unravelled. China's economic development success is widely known. Today, the nation has the second largest economy in the world, lagging only the United States. What made China an economic giant in such an incredibly short time? Answer to that question remains uncertain for a long time now. There are a lot of explanations out there behind the rise of China. The simplest one being, China gradually moved away from communism to capitalism and benefited from the fruits of free markets and private enterprise. Even though it is the simplest explanation and true in the grand sense, it is far removed from the reality of what actually happened. In this video, we will look at what the experts believe as the reason behind the Chinese transformation and how they got it totally wrong. This video also gets to the true explanation behind the Chinese transformation using the latest breakthrough research in economics. I would recommend you watch my recent video on China's economic development before you continue watching this video. You will find the link at the top of the video. In contrast to its successfully developed counterparts in East Asia such as Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan, the state-owned enterprises in China have had a much bigger role in their assistance to the country's industrialization drive. These Chinese state-owned enterprises stood out in quite a few ways. They are big. Each one operates and controls many subsidiaries. They have been big beneficiaries of state subsidies and restructuring programs. Their investment levels have been high. And the unique aspect of the state leadership's involvement in personnel management, in their operations as a state-owned enterprise and in terms of technological scope. In short, the state-owned and controlled part of the entire Chinese industry has transformed into a colossus by investing heavily and through acquisition of technology. But how did those unusual characteristics influence the Chinese industrialization drive? More importantly, are those the crucial factors behind the Chinese industrialization success? Professor Barry Norton, chair of Chinese International Affairs at the University of California and one of the premier experts on China in general and China's transition into a market economy in particular, thinks those standout characteristics of the nation do make its industrialization story complete and unique. Other eminent economists and Nobel laureates such as Angus Deaton, Joseph Stiglitz, Franco Modigliani, and other top economists such as Ishwar Prasad and many others across the world have struggled to understand China's main macroeconomic parameters and offered various explanations for its rise. One central element remains common to all of them. These experts' inability to properly explain the rise of China is due to their failure to crack the code of macroeconomics. The economists are still at wonder how China has managed a high savings rate for the past 4 decades, which propelled its stupendous rise from one of the poorest abject poverty-stricken nations to an economic superpower. Professor Barry Norton also wonders the same about China's rise and offers his take on what factors were behind the transformation in East Asia. The arguments of other economists might differ, but the flaw behind their mistaken thinking remains the same, which is their improper understanding of the workings of a nation's income, savings, and wealth. As a special focus, let's pore through a popular research paper on China's rise by Professor Barry Norton. His paper, China's Distinctive System, Can It Be a Model for Others?, published in 2010 claims the intertwining of state and market in China is at the root of China's most distinctive developmental features. The paper also highlights the unique characteristics of the nation's successful development, and it goes on to argue that none are easily copied by or readily replicated in other developing nations. He identifies 3 initial conditions that he believes were the bedrock of everything China was able to achieve in its 30-plus years of economic development. Those 3 and the manner they came to help China succeed are: First, China's huge size means a large potential internal market enough to provide room for competition among 2 to 3 large firms, attracting foreign interest and investment. Second, China's abundant, healthy, and well-trained labor meant that the nation enjoyed comparative advantage in labor-intensive activities. Third, in its transition from state planning to market during the late 1970s to the early 1980s, China retained and rebuilt a hierarchical, authoritarian political system which it deployed in its new market economy. Norton highlights the uniqueness of the 3 conditions. Simply put, nobody else is so big, possesses such a unique comparative advantage, or operates a remotely similar political system. At the core of Norton's evaluation is the focus on what enabled the high investment levels in the country. In the case of China, he asserts, taking the lowest common denominator, we could say that in the Chinese development model government ownership and government investment play a strong role in the economy. But there is a problem. To understand, we need to know something called the Spence Report. The World Bank Group tasked a group of eminent leaders and Nobel laureates led by Michael Spence in the mid-2000s to provide growth-oriented policy recommendations for developing nations. Their target was to synthesize economic research and provide policy guidelines for developing nations. What came out of that is called Spence Report. The report recommends the government should take the lead in stimulating investment in the economy and is understood as a key toward growth. Norton immediately recognizes the problem arising as a result of government taking the lead in investing, as the same was a central feature of the policies of the 1950s and the 1960s development economics, whose record of those programs was extremely mixed, to put it mildly. He asks whether government investment raises taxes and imposes costs on the economy. He summarizes the conundrum at the heart of the matter. The problem comes because there is no agreement about what mechanisms are most likely to increase investment while maintaining a modicum of efficiency. According to Norton, China's answer to this central problem is to privilege the state sector of the industry to lead the investment effort. Meaning, the Chinese Communist Party has given the mandate of undertaking large investments to the state-owned enterprises. According to Norton, the country's unique features that enabled its rise comes from this mega role played by the state-owned enterprises. To push for the state sector-led investment, the Chinese government did the following. First, the government structured market competition in an oligopolistic way that made possible large profits for state-owned firms. Second, it enabled the state sector firms to retain after-tax profits to reinvest. Third, it limited investment alternatives in such a way that it leads to reinvestment-driven expansion. In addition, the government incentivized the state officials to tilt strongly toward investment and development. Norton makes the observation that the ability of the Chinese government to influence the state-owned enterprises toward investment-driven expansion by way of reinvesting their profits is a direct flow from the three unique initial conditions of China, which we discussed earlier. How did those three initial conditions prevail? First, due to its size, the country has a huge marketplace to provide room for 2 or 3 big state-owned players, with room left for foreign firms or innovative domestic hybrid firms. That allowed the Chinese government to build some competition into all sectors in which state ownership is prominent, but in an oligopolistic way to ensure large profits. Second, because of its abundant labor force, the Chinese economy had a relatively skewed comparative advantage in labor-intensive activities. That enabled the economy to reap huge profits concerning soaring exports, especially after the WTO membership. Third, because the country had a hierarchical, authoritarian political system, it managed to avoid the most debilitating aspects associated with government failure. These three conditions enabled the Chinese government to make large investments through its state-owned enterprises. To be sure, Norton concedes that all profitability is not just due to the government's market structuring efforts but also to multiple factors. He clarifies, during the late 1990s, China closed down thousands of loss-making firms, raising overall profitability by dramatically cutting losses. After 2002, the global rise in natural resource prices combined with the surge in exports following its WTO membership created a cyclical boom in the Chinese economy that contributed to soaring profitability. Norton concludes that unlike China, nobody else is so big, possesses such a unique comparative advantage, or operates a remotely similar political system. The Chinese model, therefore, is hard to copy elsewhere in a developing country. However, Norton's argument collapses completely when one fetches answers to the cause of soaring profits that led to high investment levels in the first place. The fallacy in Norton's argument is that if only the state can stimulate investment by using any means or mechanism, and in the case of China it is the state sector, will there be high investment levels leading to sustained development. Based on our previous video on India's economic development, you will find the link at the top of the video. We know that the ability of the state in stimulating investment is limited up to 10% of national income. In other words, when the economy's ability to generate savings rate is capped, the state becomes powerless in its ability to raise investment levels beyond the figure allowed by that cap. It is correct that the source of Chinese state sector's soaring profits in the first decade of the 21st century came from soaring exports. However, it was not the oligopolistic market structure or the government's ability to generate large profits for the state sector and keeping them in a reinvestment and expansion mode that pushed the growth and development of the country. It was these things that ticked the Chinese miracle. First, the Chinese government created an environment in which businesses facing industry competition were incentivized to export in order to import capital goods only. Second, the microeconomic framework in which both private and public enterprises were incentivized to invest those export earnings in industries deemed appropriate at that stage, which led to purchasing capital goods. And third, to acquire and assimilate foreign technology, and to export further. China's size did help in its efforts to acquire advanced and frontier technology from industrialized countries. Unlike South Korea and Taiwan, China had to adopt an alternative strategy to go after technology acquisition because the country was neither an ally of the US, nor did it have full access to advanced markets. In what can be termed as technology for market access strategy, China deployed its huge internal market as its prime leverage to negotiate technology acquisition from foreign businesses at the start of the new millennia. Access to Big China was the bargaining chip the Chinese government used to gain access to foreign technology from foreign industry giants. Therefore, China's high investment rates were not a result of the state's mantra to delicately structure the market in a way to build some competition but allow for some oligopolistic profits. But instead it was a result of its ability to push up capital goods import by increasing exports to pay for the same. This means that it didn't matter whether the enterprise that was doing the investment by importing capital goods private or public. That is because the key enabler, the exports and imports of a nation, is part of the macroeconomic framework, having zero implication to the micro elements such as the nature of the ownership of the enterprises doing the exporting and importing. We have to look no further than China's neighbor, South Korea, which is many times smaller in comparison to China in terms of national income, and its big private firms, the chaebols. Each enterprise that later became a chaebol started out as a small private firm specializing in certain sector. They later expanded into multiple unrelated industries and became global giants in most of them. Just as the Chinese government closed down or restructured thousands of loss-making state-owned enterprises during the late 1990s, South Korean government forcefully bankrupted loss-making firms, and in some cases, it closed down or forced them to merge with more profitable firms throughout its industrialization drive. In South Korea and China, the state directed the existing manufacturers to export. The South Korean government enforced a particularly exacting monthly export performance monitoring system. Exporting firms were rewarded with subsidies and tax rebates in line with the performance. The export earnings, which make up most of the savings of the economy, were channeled for further investment and expansion by importing capital goods. Foreign loans were taken out with government guarantee when export earnings fell short to supply industrial expansion. It was particularly the case with South Korea after the launch of heavy chemical industry drive, the beginning of its industrialization, in 1971. That was a time when the existing big businesses were directed to expand into other large-scale investment-oriented industries such as automobiles, shipbuilding, machine tools, electronics. Thus, it was the mustering of the capacity to earn export earnings, the larger, the better, that allowed the economy to invest at a high % of GDP at the direction and guidance of the state. The actual cause and effect, therefore, is very different. It's not because of the state's ability to create market conditions and oligopolistic profits, the cause and direct enterprises to invest and expand that led to the higher investment levels, effect as Norton claims, rather it was export earnings availability, purchasing power to import capital goods, cause that paved the way for the state to direct enterprises to expand and also fund public infrastructure leading to higher investment levels, effect. In both South Korea and China, the government forcing or incentivizing the business community to invest in particular sectors in and of itself is a meaningless mechanism. That is because there exist limited funds to invest in the first place. Thus, mistaking an unimportant factor for the cause has led to assigning overt importance to the state ownership nature and the Chinese hierarchical, authoritarian political system. In both countries, the methods of originating large funds for investment were the same, only the actors differed in who was making the investment. Private enterprises in South Korea, public enterprises in China. At the heart of the things that provided the ground for Norton's arguments in the paper remain the mysterious workings of the macroeconomy, whose understanding is coming to light only recently. There is this inherent belief among the economic community that if only the government can stimulate investment by way of directing businesses to invest and expand, would a country achieve higher investment rates and develop. It is entirely incorrect, and our exposition in earlier video on India's economic development refutes that kind of thinking. That's it for today. If you want to learn more about the content in this video and learn the Chinese miracle in much more detail, dive into the recently released The General Theory of Rapid Economic Development book. You'll find the link in the description below. Hit the thumbs up button if you like this video. Send your thoughts to me in the comments section below. Subscribe to this channel if you want to watch more quality content like this.